All right, good morning. How are you guys? Sweet. I'm doing good too. Happy Sunday. It's really good to be together here with you guys. If you're a visitor, hi. If you're not a visitor, also hi. If you're in summer mode, which means, I don't know, you only come to the Sunday gathering occasionally because this is Portland, the land of non-committal, then welcome to the Sunday gathering. So it's good to have you guys here. My name's Tim. I'm one of the pastors here. We're going to explore a passage of Scripture like we always do during this time. We're in this series called The New Day. We're looking at what Jesus and his earliest followers, his earliest representatives, the apostles, have to say when they think about the future hope for Christians and for the world. And that the resurrection of Jesus is at the heart of that. And so we're looking at a really dense, complex paragraph from one of Paul the Apostle's letters. I don't know if you know this, but one of the other apostles, his name is Peter. Maybe you've heard of him. And he wrote a letter that's in the New Testament. It's called 1 Peter. And he reflects on his co-worker Paul and his writing style in 2 Peter, and he says, Paul's letters, he says, God bless that man. God given him lots of wisdom, but he's really hard to understand. It says it's a biblical author saying another biblical author is really difficult to read and understand. And that's true. That's how Paul writes, is in these dense, theological, holy cow type paragraphs. And so I'm going to do my best, but this is a magnificent passage of Scripture that has surprising things to say to us. The last few months here on planet Earth have been alarming. And whether more human beings have died on planet Earth than the previous, 3 months or so on, somebody could probably do the math on that one. But the world in which we live, with the screen media in our lives constantly, in our pockets and at homes, it makes us woven in to the story of what's happening here on planet Earth in a new and different way that's like people haven't lived the way that we live because of our constant access to it. And so this has been an overwhelming few months for most people in the modern world who have access to screens, because what our screens are telling us now on a weekly, sometimes daily basis is of some new, horrifying tragedy where a very small number of people destroy the lives and kill lots of other people. So within the last few days, of course, what happened in Kabul, or what happened in Munich, that's just the weekend, the setup to the weekend, whether it's everything going on with the tragic shootings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and then the shooting of police officers, the horrible tragedies that happened after that, and then we're talking about Nice in Paris. Are you with me? It's overwhelming. And, I have habits during my day that I have to keep under control of opening up my news apps and staying in tune with what's happening. But, and I'm sure this is true for you too. How have you ever in your life experienced so many moments of hearing or seeing news of a tragedy and having that thing that happens inside of you? And I don't know what you say, I don't know what your response is, but it's never happened to me so many times in such a short amount of time as the last few months. Are you with me? And what do you do? It becomes, I'm sure we're all going to remember this season of our lives, just like some people can remember precisely the moment that JFK or Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and where they were and when they heard the news. My hunch is that this summer is going to be something like that in all of our life memories as we go on. And so how do you begin to sort out the anxiety and confusion of getting barraged that much. There have been multiple news media outlets that have put out articles in the last week about how to consume the media that they're putting out about these tragedies. New York Times had this interesting piece that said, listen, you need to not be listening to the New York Times all the time. You need to guard how much time you spend following these stories, because it's going to mess you up if you become consumed by these stories. Not being ignorant, but not allowing it to rule your life. And so how do you sort out, right? The anxiety, the vulnerability, the fear, and there is in the Bible, the first 3 quarters of the Bible, specifically what Christians call the Old Testament, there is an amazing set of resources here teaching us how to grieve and how to sort through our anxiety and emotions before God. There's a whole book of the Bible that teaches God's people how to grieve. It's called the Book of Lament. It's its name, Lamentations. And there is another book of the Bible, fully half of which, the book of Psalms, fully half of it is people who are angry and confused at God and don't have a problem telling him so. Right? That's what half of these poems are in the book of Psalms. And they teach us the language of grief and anxiety in the presence of God. And there's one passage in what we call Psalm 31. It's a powerful poem. But it has this passage that I think is relevant for us in this cultural moment. The poet says this in Psalm 31. He says, "Be merciful to me, Lord. I'm in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction and my bones grow weak." This is a remarkable part of the poem. There's 7 lines there, and if you look at the last word in each line, it's a different description of the emotional suffering. Do you see that there? Distress, sorrow, grief, anguish, groaning, affliction, weakness. So whatever the circumstances are, the poem invites us into a place where we name precisely every one of our emotions. We give attention to it, not stuff it. We name it before God and pour it all out. And there's something, I've highlighted one of them here, the word groaning, because it sticks out. Do you see how it sticks out in the poem? Every one of those other words refers to an emotional state, except groaning. Yeah, you feel weakness. That's also a physical state. You feel distress and sorrow, but do you feel groaning? What is groaning? Groaning is something that you do. Yeah, you don't do sorrow or do anguish. It's what you feel. Groaning is something you do. What's groaning? It's a sound that you make, isn't it? It's a sound. And here's what's interesting. Almost all languages have this. Words that sound like what they mean. And in Hebrew, you can see there the Hebrew word for groan. It's one of those words, the last letter is the clearing your throat letter. So, anach. Anach. It's a sound that you make. It's like when you're under the weight of something heavy and you breathe out. Anach. Anach is what you do when you have to make a noise, but you are bypassing your intellect that's trying to articulate with words what you feel, and you just make a noise. Are you with me? So we have these words in English. You see them in comics sometimes, ugh or arg or something, ugh. If you grew up on the Kathy comic strip in the newspapers, remember what Kathy always said? Ack, yeah, A-C-K, ack. Ack. So here we go. We're in this realm here. Groaning. I don't have the ability to even articulate the stress, the anxiety, the pain, and the confusion, but I have to make a noise. Anach. Anach. I don't have to explain it anymore, do I? I mean, I can't think of a better word to describe the number of times that I've opened up or woken up and tuned into my news app, and I'm being informed of some new horrific destruction of human life. And that's it. It comes out of me. Whether it's like no or like anach. That's this word. And my hunch is that you know exactly, you have felt this too, and know what the poet's talking about here. Anach is an interesting word for lots of reasons. Its meaning, that it gets us all on the same page, as we all know what this feels like. It's also significant. It's used a lot in the Hebrew Bible, but what's really significant is the first time this word occurs in the Bible. If you start on page 1 and you just read through looking for the first person who groans, first person who anachs, it's very significant the first time it occurs. I'm going to read you the paragraph, and some of you will know instantly the moment in the story that we're at. It's in Exodus chapter 2. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites, anach, in their slavery, they cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And God heard their groaning. And so he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites, and he was concerned about them. It's the first time anach, groaning, appears in the story of the Bible. And this is a key moment in arguably one of the most important stories in the whole Bible. It's the story that the book is named after, yeah? Exodus. And I often joke, perhaps you've seen the movie, or maybe you actually read the story. But this is key. This is a turning point moment. This is the family of Abraham. And God said to this family earlier on that he was going to restore his blessing to all of the nations through this family, that they're marked for God's purpose in some way. And the family grows, and then they go down to Egypt looking for food. And the king of Egypt sees this exploding immigrant population, right, in his own land. And in Pharaoh, the king of Egypt's mind, this is a national security threat. And so he does what many nations do in this case. So he ends up rallying them all together, puts them in slave labor camps. They start building the pyramids, precisely the period of some of the late pyramids, storage cities. So he's grinding them into the dirt. And then he starts killing their children, throwing their boys, baby Israelite boys, into the river. And that's this moment right here. And the story, it culminates with their verbal but non-verbal, right? It's a noise. They can't even articulate the suffering and the pain. And here it's important because it's not just that having that done to you and your people is horrible. That is horrible. But it's also the groaning, right? The anach. That pain arises out of this tension in the story because this is the family. God made promises to us that somehow he's going to bless the nations through us and our people, and yet this is happening to us? Do you see this? The groaning isn't just about this is a hard circumstance. The groaning is about this is who we believe God to be, but this is what's happening in reality, and I don't see how these two things make sense together. It seems like a contradiction. That God's made a covenant to us, but yet this is happening to us. And the groaning comes out of that awful tension. Are you with me in the story? So do you know how the story goes? The Pharaoh's evil turns back onto him because God does raise up a deliverer to save his people. His name's Moses. And how does it happen? It happens through an Israelite baby getting thrown in the water. But this one doesn't drown. It floats into Pharaoh's own family and then becomes the very person who will bring down Pharaoh's kingdom and liberate God's people. It's the story of the Exodus. And so this story became so important because this was the groaning of God's people, which is actually even more intense because they know God's promise and God's character. And that tension is what creates an even more intense groaning. But yet they were delivered through Moses in the story of the Exodus. And so this story right here gets told and retold for centuries. Annually, Israelites have this festival meal called Passover, and they retell the story of their groaning, which led to liberation from slavery. And so as Israel went on through time, as they encountered later periods of suffering and grief and groaning, they would recall this story from the past. I'll just show you one example. By the way, this is a message about Romans, trust me. So we're getting there, right? But they would recall this story from the past. So Isaiah the prophet's a great example. Israel's suffering under oppression from different bad guys, but bad guys nonetheless. And here's how Isaiah puts it when he gives voice to his groaning. Isaiah 51. He says, "Awake, awake, O arm of the Lord. Clothe yourself with strength." This is also, if you've read the story, you won't get this from the movie, but you'll get it from the story. There's a line repeated through the story where God says he's going to free his enslaved people with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. It gets repeated many times throughout the story of the Exodus. And so what Isaiah, he looks out on Israel of his day, and he's like, I think the arm of the Lord is asleep. God's asleep. Because look at the world. And look at what's happening to us and to our people. So it's a poem asking God to wake up. Wake up, O arm of the Lord. Be strong. Just wake up just like you did back in the Exodus. Just like in days gone by, as in generations of old. I mean, wasn't it you who dried up the sea? The waters of the great deep? Wasn't it you who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the people you redeemed out of slavery could go over? I think that was you, the God of Israel. Let me see, check my Bible. Yep, that was you, all right? So do it again. Why are you asleep? It's very bold, powerful. And then he states his confidence. He says, yes, it will happen again. Those that the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them. Sorrow and anach will flee. It's very intentional, this use of language here. And so where this lands God's people is in this place of tension, where the way that God's people experience the world is both living by God's promise to liberate and bring into freedom his enslaved people, and as we'll see, creation and world, but it's not fully happened yet. And what this does is it intensifies the groaning. If you are looking for a life of trying to escape your experience of groaning, don't become a follower of Jesus. Actually, following Jesus will increase the tension in your life because you believe so firmly that this world isn't the way it's supposed to be, yet it seems like it's just continuing on. And where is God and why isn't he doing something? That's what it means to be a part of God's people. And it's this story of we're waiting. It's God's done it in the past. He's relieved the groaning of his people, and he's going to do it again somehow, and it's through a deliverer that he'll raise up. And I would submit to you that this is exactly the story that Paul is inviting us into in Romans chapter 8. Paul's deep conviction, along with all of the earliest Christians, is that Jesus of Nazareth is the deliverer. He is the arm of the Lord embodied as a human being. And that he came and that what he did was for others. That he lived for us as the human that we are all made to be, but perpetually fail to be. That he died for us, that he took into himself the consequences of all of the sin and the selfishness that we unleash into the world. And he allowed it to kill him and destroy him, but not gain victory over him. His was the victory when he walked out of the empty tomb on Easter morning and declared that his life and his love is more powerful than human evil and death. And so what Paul's firm conviction is that Jesus is the arm of the Lord waking up to rescue his world. And if you grab on to faith, if you grab on to Jesus in faith and in trust, which is about allegiance and devotion and just hanging on to him for dear life, even when it doesn't make a lot of sense, that something happens, that all of a sudden what's true of Jesus becomes true of me as one of his people, that he became what I am so that I can become what he is. And death and resurrection is a key part of this. Cameron helped us explore this in Romans 6 last week. But here's how Paul puts it just right before the paragraph we're reading in Romans chapter 8. In verse 11, he puts it this way. If the spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, then he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his spirit who lives in you. Jesus became a human, subject to mortality and death, but God's life-giving presence raised him from the dead. And when I join myself to Jesus, I become what he is. The hope of resurrection. His resurrection becomes my hope. How you guys doing? Okay, now let's pause for a second here. So, as we're going to see today, for Paul, this is the concrete hope, is the hope of resurrection. But here's what I've found, and I know I found it because it's true for me. I think at this point, most of us get kind of blurry and muddy, if you've ever tried to think about this as a Christian. Okay, so Jesus came out of the empty tomb, and that's resurrection. Most of what I know about Christianity, or maybe you've grown up with it or something, is that what you're hoping for is to get away from earth after you die, and that will be your form of escape to go to some other place, some place of disembodied, non-physical bliss that involves a cloud and a harp and singing a song for eternity, I guess. I don't know. I'm just going off of comic strips or something. Like, are you with me? Like that's what most people think Christians believe, and that is in fact what most Christians believe is their hope. And then you're like, I guess I'll be a resurrected person doing that? I don't know. I hope the cloud is comfortable. We don't think about it that much. And so what Paul has to say about the resurrection and groaning and future hope, it's surprising. He doesn't say at all what you would expect him to say. And the story that he paints here is so profound. It's so profound that it's been a game changer for me as a follower of Jesus. And that's having this Exodus story, I think, will help us make sense, trust me, of what he says. Look what he says in verse 18, which is where we're beginning here. He says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So Paul acknowledges, here's what it's like to live in the moment, the present world as we know it, as a follower of Jesus, suffering, right? Hardship. The world's screwed up, we're really screwed up, present suffering. But then what he says is, our present experience of suffering in the world isn't worth comparing to what he calls the glory to be revealed. Now, if what you have in your head is eternity in some non-physical form, laying down on a cloud, whistling a worship song, my hunch is you wouldn't say this out loud, but you would be like, yeah, I don't know. I'd kind of rather go have a sunset dinner with my friend in Portland than do that. Are you with me? Well, yeah, like Paul's saying, like, glory is not worth comparing with anything you experience now in the present. And you're like, well, I don't know. Maybe clouds are comfortable. I don't know. I don't want to sing forever. I don't know. Maybe I'll learn how to play the harp. I'm trying to be honest here. Anybody? Be like, oh, I guess that's cool. I don't know. Where did those images even come from in the first place? And you discover that most of them are not actually quite from the Bible in the first place. So what does Paul have in his head? Paul has in his head a future that is so beautiful and so real and robust and compelling that our experience of groaning in the present, they're not even comparable to each other. What is that? Well, look at what he goes on to say. He says, for the creation is waiting in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. Now, if your story about future, what Christians believe about the future, is this escape through death story, or escape through Jesus returning and everything else is left behind, and then we go to some other non-physical world forever, and this place is left to rot or heat death or something. Why on earth would the creation be waiting for that? Are you with me? Creation is waiting in eager expectation to be incinerated while we all go somewhere else. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all, because that's not what Paul thinks is going to happen. He has a different story in his head. It's called the story of the Exodus. And he's going to be as clear as day about it, starting in just another sentence here. And what he does is he says, okay, let's stop. Maybe he knows that he's being opaque here. So he stops and he says, okay, let's go back to pages 1 through 3 of the Bible. That's my paraphrase of what he's saying in verse 20. Look what he says next. He says, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. Let's just stop right there. That's Paul saying, okay, let me stop. Let me remind you of the big story here of the Bible. He goes back to pages 1 through 3. If you've ever wanted to know where I picked up the habit of always taking everything in the Bible back to pages 1 through 3, it's because I learned from the master right here. So he's retelling the story of creation. Creation, apparently, and by creation he means the non-human, what we call the universe or nature. The universe is eagerly waiting for something, and it has to do with the glory of God's people and their hope in the future. What's that about? So he says, let's go back here to think about how this thing got started. When God made his world, what did God have to say about his world on page 1 of the Bible? He brought out of darkness and chaos, he brought beauty in a garden. And what does God have to say about this world? It's good. How many times does he say it? He says 7 times over. It's good. And the 7th time he says, it's really, really good. I like this a lot. God likes our world. He likes it. Loves it, even. So there's that. But then the story is really significant how it moves on next. What God does is he rules and oversees his planet by appointing creatures, humans, as his image, God's image. And he says, as my image, you will rule and oversee this thing. And the image is so powerful. It's of creator and creature, right? God and humanity existing as partners together in intimacy and closeness and trust to then take this world into new, undiscovered territory. And of course, if you know the story, how it goes, humanity, that is us, we're all a part of this, we don't want to be managers, we want to be shareholders. Right? We don't want to just manage and oversee, we want to be the boss. We want to define the terms of what's good and evil and where this world's supposed to go. We rebel. And what happens in the story is so interesting is that God doesn't roast everything. What he does is he allows the world to become subjected to frustration. He allows the dignified creatures that he's made to rule the world. He allows them to take creation down with them, so to speak. The story could be written many times, say of like a restaurant here in Portland or something. Maybe you have a favorite restaurant, and this has happened, where it was, the burger or the kimchi, something. It was the magic, it was the magic. And then it gets popular, and then like the staff gets bigger, and then it's not as good anymore. Anybody? This has happened to you. This has happened to you. And so what happens, it's like, management changes or bad leadership, something, it's not as good anymore. And then the bathrooms are dirty all the time, you notice, and then it's like a bunch of people are quitting. The head chef that made the original magic, that chef leaves. And then it's not good anymore, and then the parking lot's always dirty and full of cigarette butts and crushed up Willamette Weeks, and you're just like, I don't want to go there anymore. Anybody? This has happened to you? So here's what doesn't pop into your mind as a solution. Oh, I know what the solution is. We need to incinerate the place. Right? You might be that angry that you can't have that burger anymore or whatever, but you're not going to think like, it needs to be burned down or whatever. That's not what you think. What you think is what? We need new management. We need a new owner who will take this place and make of it what we know it's fully capable of. That's the story Paul has in his mind. And so what does it mean to say that the universe, nature, the physical world was subject to frustration? I was talking to the worship team earlier, and I was asking, what is the nicest piece of equipment this morning up here? And apparently it's not an instrument, it's an amp. Do you see this amp right over here? Right back here? If maybe you should come up and look at it afterwards. It looks like it's dressed in a suit. It's beautiful. There's this beautiful cloth, striped cloth, and that's because it's handmade. It's a Benson amp made by our own Chris Benson and co. here, Door of Hope. Apparently, so I hear, this is a really remarkable, unique piece of equipment that is sought after by many people around the world. So there you go. That's the nicest piece of equipment. If this amp was given to me as a birthday gift this fall, and that's not a subtle ploy, I don't want the amp. This is just an illustration, right? So if this amp would be given to me, my birthday this fall, what would happen to it? Well, I don't know how to play the guitar. So I can hack out G, C, A, D, and E minor on my acoustic, and it's not a pretty sight, and you don't want to hear it. I don't know how, and the electric guitar is a mystery to me. So if this was to be given to me, here's what would happen. It would sit in my closet, then my two boys would discover it, and then they would like draw on it and tear it apart, and it would be subject to frustration. So when he says creation is subject to frustration, he doesn't mean frustrated in terms of like, oh, I'm angry, I'm frustrated. Frustration it's an inability to fulfill its purpose. So creation has been subject to this state of existence where it doesn't fulfill its purpose. Why? Because it's under really bad management. Us. Us. We are the problem in this equation. And if just read Romans 1 through 7, and that's what Paul does, a really thorough diagnosis of the human condition. It's under bad management. And the solution, right, when something is under bad management is not to destroy it. It's to rescue it. It's to install better new managers who will make of it what its purpose is and take it where it's intended to go. And does Paul the Apostle believe that there exists a human who is the clue to the future of a creation rightly managed? Does Paul believe that a human exists who can take creation where it's supposed to go? Answer, yes. And you can get this one all right. Just say it. It wants to come out naturally, right? Who is it? It's Jesus. It's Jesus. It's the exalted, risen Jesus, who's Lord and who's King. And so watch how he goes on from right here. He says, listen, creation was subjected to frustration, not because it wanted to, but by the will of the one who subjected it. And there's a lot of debate about who this is. I think the only option that makes sense is God. So it's God allowing human beings to still manage. Human beings didn't stop ruling the world when we rebelled. We just rule it badly now, really badly. Look at your life. Look at the world history, and there you go. Like we're bad. When we think we're God, we make really bad managers. And so now the question is, well, what's going to happen? Because we've taken creation down with us, but he's not done yet. Look what he says. It's been subjected to frustration in hope that creation itself will be liberated. And anytime you hear slavery, redemption, freedom, liberation language, what story in the Bible ought to fully come into your mind? The Exodus story. Creation itself will be liberated from its slavery to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been doing what under bad management? What's it doing? It's groaning. It's groaning. Why are the Israelites groaning in Exodus chapter 2? Why? They're enslaved. They're being killed by whom? Pharaoh. Bad management. And Paul invites us to see the story of the universe as within the story of the Exodus. That the universe is groaning. Why? Because of us. We have become Pharaoh in this story. And the way that we treat each other, the way that we treat the creation, apparently, puts it into a state of groaning. What you feel when you hear a headline and you're like, no, this is not what it's supposed to be, apparently is what the creation feels like when it wakes up in the morning and it sees us walking around. Oh, no. Oh, no. This is not what's supposed to be. Yeah? When we laugh, but it's very powerful. Very powerful. But then look what Paul does here. He's a brilliant wordsmith, which is what makes him hard to read sometimes, because he just packs his sentences full. So he says, all creation has been groaning. What's it waiting for? It's waiting for liberation, for freedom. So God's going to do for creation what he did for his people. He's going to free it from bad management. And he's going to do that by bringing it into the freedom and the glory of God's children. So now we're brought into this. So somehow what Paul thinks is going to happen in the future, it involves human beings, but because it involves human beings, it involves this world and creation. And that's because he's firmly committed that we're earthlings. We're of the earth. And that God likes this world, and that he's committed to rescuing it from us. But he's done it in such a way that he can rescue us and rescue at the creation at the same time. And that's what's happened through Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And so look at what he says now. Because he believes that Jesus is the key, he can say that the creation is groaning, but it's groaning, he morphs it, like the pains of childbirth. So now it's not just the Exodus slavery groaning, it's labor pains. Now at this point I could stop and just invite all of the women who have experienced labor before, and you just tell us your story. And that would be a great finish to this sermon. So I'm unqualified, right, to talk about this. I've been present. I've stood and been next to the same woman 2 times through this experience. And, oh my gosh, it's just such a category-shattering experience. Like, this is how it happens. And so groaning. So there's a woman's body kicks into gear, and this human needs to be outside of the body by the end of this story. Right? That is going to happen. It's crazy. It's like aliens. It's crazy. So that's how it happens. And then the human body kicks into gear a process that, so I observe and hear, is excruciatingly painful. And that's groaning. And that pain is often untranslatable into any language. There are often 4-letter words that are used to describe the pain, and no woman is responsible for anything she says while she's in labor. We're convinced of that, so it doesn't matter. 4-letter words, or, the words are impossible, and so it's arg, groaning. And what Paul invites us to see is that the world as you and I know it is a world writhing in pain. But it is a world that God is so committed to that even all of this groaning and pain and suffering, it's moving towards a new life, new creation. It's so powerful, the image he uses here. So now he's in 2 metaphors. We're in slavery to liberation and freedom, and now we're at pain and childbirth into new life and new creation. But this is the story Paul has in his head here. And not only this, he's going to pile it on. Not only so, but we ourselves, this is verse 23, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we are groaning inwardly. So we're in a groaning creation that's like, oh no, humans again. And then we're groaning too, we who have the Spirit. It's the same life animating presence of the Creator God that raised Jesus from the dead, and that we grab onto Jesus in faith, and it's at work in me too, even though I can't always see it or sense it, that what the Spirit does is it activates even more groaning in me. This is why I said earlier, if you want to avoid confusion and heartache in this world, don't follow Jesus. It will intensify your heartache and confusion. Because all of a sudden, if you follow Jesus, you have a real historical person you can point at to say, he's the solution to it all. So why isn't God doing anything? Why are things continuing on the way that they are? Where are you? Wake up, O arm of the Lord. Why aren't you doing something? Another day, I'm going to see another headline. Really? Welcome to being a follower of Jesus. We groan. And somehow that groaning, I need to get a new story about that. It's actually not a sign of God's absence. It's a sign that God has given over the human story to what we wanted and what we create in the world, but that he will redeem it and he will steer this thing towards new creation and new life somehow. And you and I sit here in the present and we groan. That's the story. And what we're awaiting is what he calls the redemption of our bodies. So in Paul the Apostle's mind, what it means to be a Christian and have hope, I think this is what he's saying, and I'm pretty certain this is what he means. It's to believe and to hope that the future of the universe is what walked out of the empty tomb on Easter morning. That God is committed to this world, not in the state that it's in. It has to be transformed and reborn and liberated in an extremely important way that will change it forever. But it will be this world, and it will be you, and it will be me. Think about the Jesus who came out of the empty tomb. Was it Jesus? Yep. Was he recognizable to people who walked around with him in Galilee? Usually, but sometimes not too, right? The risen Jesus, right? We read a story about that in this series where there were two people who walked around with him for a couple years, and then when they saw the risen Jesus, they didn't at first recognize him, and that was because they had all these wrong assumptions about who he was and so on. But then they do see him. Is Jesus in a body? Is he a human in a body, walking out of the tomb? Yes, he had many meals with dozens, even hundreds of his followers afterwards, which I assume means that he pooped out that meal too, unless there's something else new about the human body. But are you with me? He's a human. He ate food. But yet at the same time, there would be moments where the disciples would be in a room and they didn't think Jesus was with them. And then he's with them. And then he's not with them. That's remarkable. I'm not able to do that, and neither can you. So there's something, Jesus' body underwent a transformation, a freedom from bondage to decay, but he's a human. He's the prototype of whatever it is where you and I are heading and the universe is going. It's the risen Jesus is the future of the universe. And you might think, this is like science fiction. Welcome to Christianity. Right? This is what it means to be a Christian, is to believe that what is true of Jesus is true of me, and Paul believes it's what will be true of the whole universe. Now, there are passages in the Bible, we're going to look at them later in the series. Will Paul himself or other biblical authors will use other images to talk about the future. They'll use images of fire and judgment to talk about how God is going to deal with evil in this world. But I think when we see all of these passages together, what we see, it's right here. It's of liberation and freedom. And that this world, including you and me, have to be reborn if we're ever going to get right management over the place and for creation to be what it's destined to become. So my hunch is that what Paul's saying here actually really messes up your theology or what you believe, because it did for me, until I realized, I think this is great. I have a professor who used to say, don't read the Bible if you're comfortable with your life and beliefs as a Christian, because it'll just mess up everything you think you believe. And I think this is one of these. What Paul is inviting us to is so profound. It's a vision of hope that in the same breath, Paul can look the current suffering, groaning world in the face and name it and see it for what it is. To have hope as a Christian is not escapism, because a part of my hope is the cross, is that the cross is the embodiment of everything that's wrong with us and everything that we do to each other. That Jesus comes among us, and what do? We kill him. But it also in that moment, it's God gaining victory over our selfishness and evil and sin. And whatever the empty tomb means, it's the future. And it's physical. And it's here, but a new here. And that's the Christian hope. And I think what this does, it enables us to sit here in this present tension, and we read the headlines, right? And maybe your experience of groaning is overwhelming, feeling overwhelmed by the headlines and the anxiety and the vulnerability we all feel when we go to a mall or a grocery store now. There's that. But there's also a million little groans that come along through life. It's because we're subject to death and the dissipation of our existence through sin and selfishness. It might be the death of an opportunity. Something happens in your life and you think you're going one direction, and something really difficult or horrible happens, and boom, your life's not going to do that anymore. And it's very difficult for us to come to terms with that reality. That's the death of a dream, the death of an opportunity. For some of us, we groan because of the breakdown in our relationships with each other, and what I did or what that person did, and we can't sort it out, and you just go on now in this fractured existence. And it's horribly painful when that happens in our relationships, and we groan. We wonder, why can't we fix this? Our bodies break down, and you're a lot more sore than you were 5 years ago when you did the same exact thing, and you're like, dang it, it's happening to me too, right? And we groan. There's a million reasons why we groan. And as a Christian, it doesn't mean I'm called to ignore it or turn that frown upside down and just like act, right? It's not escapism. As a Christian, I can name it and face it for what it is. But I don't believe that groaning is the end of the story. What I believe is in more than myself, it's of God's commitment to our good world, that he's going to rescue it from us, that he's going to rebirth it and free it and liberate it to become exactly what it's made to be. Jesus became what we are so that in him we become who he is and what we're truly made to be. So let me land the plane. As we come to a time of worship in the bread and the cup, we all have our own stories of groaning as we sit here today. Some of which is a story for why you're hurting and confused and in pain that nobody else knows about, because you can't tell anybody. It's so personal or difficult. And I think as we come to take the bread and the cup and worship, we're eating the bread and the cup, the moment where Jesus becomes what we are. He dies on our behalf. And as the Apostle Paul said, when we eat the bread and the cup, we are also announcing our hope. That this death is not the final word, but that resurrection and new creation is where this story is going. And so it's existing in that tension. So here's what I would encourage you to do. What is the thing, the relationship, the disappointment, the lost loved one, your own anxiety about the state of the world, the thing that makes you groan right now, and just to bring it to Jesus. And lay it before him as we take the bread and the cup and ask him what it means for you to live with hope in light of his resurrection. Amen? Let me close in a word of prayer.